Today, we're going to talk about the conversation of improvisation and how improvisation differs from memorization. I'm Deborah Henson-Conant, also known as Deborah, also known as DHC, and I meet here usually every week with Kathleen Wiley, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst. I am a composer, a performer, and an educator, and we both play the harp, and so we call this Jung at Harp. And each week we meet to explore an idea. We don't come with answers, we come with questions. And this comes out of a conversation that we had many years ago when we discovered that together we really enjoy exploring ideas. And so we created this podcast out of it. Kathleen is not available today. She's at a conference. And so when she's not here, I like to meet anyway and have a conversation with you. This particular website, this way that we're projecting this into the ether and the internet, makes it possible for you to be part of the conversation through the chat function on not all, but most of the channels that we're broadcasting this live on. So if you're out there here live, and I know a lot of people watch this later on, but if you're watching live, you can take part in this conversation. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say and the questions that you have. But in the meantime, this week, I was exploring the idea of what is a journeyman musician? What is someone who is a functional musician versus what we often think of as someone who is the reason I was thinking about this is that a lot of in my role as an educator, I'm teaching harp players how to improvise towards their ability to create something of their own in the world. Whatever that is. It might be simply being able to sit down and play for themselves, or it might be to create a song for their grandchildren. It might be to do a house concert. It might be, I'm speaking specifically of things that people do in Hip Harp Academy, which is what this is called. And I'm constantly trying to come up with a word for what I'm teaching, because I'm not teaching the conservatory model. That's not the model that I went through. I didn't start studying music until I was in my early 20s, and I had a whole life of music before that, a whole life of music as a functional musician before I ever took a music lesson. And it's probably because I grew up in a family in which music was it was just a functional thing. I mean, everybody sang. That's how we entertained ourselves and each other. And I learned how to improvise or play lead sheets, jazz charts on the piano so that I could have the role of playing while other people sang. So it was very, very functional. And my grandmother, Edith, who was a farmer and a grade school teacher. I think she taught kindergarten. I don't know what she taught. She taught grade school, and her opinion of music was, people have to sing. Someone has to keep them together. That's why you play an instrument. So growing up with this really functional idea of music, and now teaching people what I consider to be functional music in a world in which music is seen as something that is competitive, something that gives you, like, are you good at it? Are you good at it? Are you good? There's a lot for me to there's an expectation of what music is that first I have to break down before I can even teach. And so I'm always thinking about that. And so I was looking at that up, and I was looking at, how to even get a word for this. I thought it was a journeyman musician, but I think a journeyman musician is someone who really is professionally out there, able to fulfill all the roles of a musician. And so I looked more at the concept of a functional musician. So what does it mean to fulfill the roles of a musician? And the musician has many, 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 many roles, especially if you look back historically. Musicians were a lot of them were with harps going from town to town because the harp was a very light instrument to carry around, though not as light as the flute, but not as likely to be lost as the flute, mind you. So the musician would be entertaining, the musician would be creating stories, the musician would be stories or history, had this huge function, and the musician would be accompanying people to dance, they would be accompanying people to sing, and they would be creating the rhythm. There was all these things that now today we watch Netflix or we go to the movies. This was the musician was bringing this into the world. Now, I may have a slightly one-sided view of this, being a musician, but there is certainly something that I consider to be a functional musician. And when I'm teaching people how to improvise, I'm teaching them how to, it's really funny because I kind of feel like a carpenter in that music is almost a thing that you can build with. Well, I experience it as a thing you can build with. And I know how to build because that's what I did as a kid. It was one of my tools, one of the many tools that I had that I was given to play with. I did have toys, but not really. I was mostly given things and then told to play with them as toys. For example, my grandmother Edith and I would go, if we went to the beach, she would get those kelps that had the little head on them, and then they had the little things hanging down, and we'd bring them home and we would make dolls out of them. So I just grew up in a culture in which things were made into other things all the time, and they were made into things to play with. So I grew up that way, but that's not necessarily how others grow up. And so many people feel that if I'm going to play music, I better play it the way it's on the page, or I'm insulting the composer. In fact, I remember one day I was playing something that I had written, because I was always writing music, even though I couldn't read it, but I was inventing music. And I think I'd finally learned how to write something down, and I was playing it for my mother, and I in the middle of playing it, I was like, oh, I don't like that. And I took out a pencil and I started crossing it out, and she was like, you can't do that. And I was like, yeah, I can. What do you mean? And she was like, oh, I had it in my mind that, you couldn't cross it out because that's what the composer wrote. I think that's what most of us think. You can't take what the composer wrote and change it. Well, you can. I mean, you can, especially if you can't play what the composer wrote. And I think that there's this idea in people's minds that here is the music. It's a pair of glasses. You wear it as a pair of glasses, and that's what you do. And you don't take it apart and do something else with it. And if you don't need glasses, you don't get the glasses. And that's how music works as well. But it's not. So one of the things that I'm teaching this quarter, I call it grounded expansion method. And the reason I call it that is because that's how I first experienced it. And it came out of a situation in which I had to play a piece of music that I couldn't play. I had to play it for a certain amount of time that didn't exist. And I've told this story many times because it was one of those moments of just complete, where there was my life before this and then there was my life after it. And before then, music to me was writing stories, creating songs, and playing them and having fun with them, and writing musicals, things like that. That's how I saw music. But after this moment, I was able to improvise with an instrument. Meaning, well, it's just nothing I'd ever tried doing. I wasn't a pianist. I played the piano in order to be able to sing and play. So it never occurred to me to improvise or embellish or anything. It was just very functional. Like, play this because that's what you want to sing. But in this moment, and I'll tell you about that moment, and bear with me if you've heard this 500 times, I started playing the harp when I was in my early 20s. I had gone back to school because I was writing a musical called The Golden Cage, and I didn't know how to write it down. And as I sat there seeing the whole thing, knowing that I had this whole story and everything I wanted to write, sitting there and thinking, hello, you are illiterate. What are you going to do? You're going to memorize this whole thing and walk around with this because you don't know how to write it down. And I thought, yeah, you're right. What am I going to do? And then the other me said, like, well, go to school, learn how to do it. Up until that point, I left high school early. I didn't go to college because I didn't know what was I going to go there for. What did I want? But in this moment, I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted to learn how to read and write music well enough that I could finish this particular play. And so I found a college near me, a junior college, a community college, which was great. It was called College of Marin. And I went there to study how to read and write music. And they happen to have an amazing music department. And they happen to have a harp in a closet. And I had a couple lessons on different instruments as a kid because my parents had noticed, yeah, clearly she's a musician. Okay, well, we'll give her piano lessons. And I really didn't like the piano lessons. And so they were like, okay, we'll give her guitar lessons. And it was mainly based on who my mother knew. If my mother knew a guitarist, and she did because she was at the North Carolina School of the Performing Arts. So she had these wonderful teachers there. And so they tried this and they tried this and they tried that. And they had also tried the harp. And after about 6 lessons, it just was not for me. And so I didn't think at that point, I think they were just like, I see, she does not want lessons. She just wants to play. She wants to know how it works. Let's leave her alone. It's cheaper. So they did. But when I got to college and they needed a harp player, and I'd had these 6 lessons, I was the greatest. I was able to do it. So, and I was ready at that point. I was actually very interested. And I got a teacher that made me interested in music. And partly she made me interested in music because she saw me immediately as a composer. And pretty much everything she taught me helped me go in that direction. Even when she was teaching me how to read and play classical music, she was teaching me how to also, she was giving me opportunities to be a composer. But I needed to make a living. I needed to pay for that harp. And so I had this harp and I started playing it, and I got a job in a restaurant as a sub. And so there I was sitting, and at that point, I could play 4 tunes. They were in a very simple little book. I could not read well, so it's not like I could, let me do this, and let me do this, and this, that. So I was reading, and I just kept reading these 4 little tunes over and over again. And at one point, this waiter came up, stood next to me, looked down at me, smiled. He was holding a little towel over his hand. He had a pitcher of water, beautiful pitcher of water, looks down at me and says, if you play those 4 tunes again, I'm pouring this pitcher of water in your lap. And it was a stark moment because I needed that job. I knew I wasn't I got immediately what was happening, that I was probably bothering the guests, but I was really driving the waitstaff crazy. And I didn't know what to do because I didn't have the skills. And I looked down at the piece that I was playing at that moment, and it had a little melody I'd learned, and it was a lovely little melody, and I will play it now. It went like. It was really easy to play. It had a lot of repetition in it. So I could play that, and I loved it. I thought it was really lovely. And it was by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which fascinated me. Why is this person I know of as the person who wrote the social contract upon which our Constitution is based? What is he doing in my music book? Was there a time in the world where composers and, philosophers and politicians, where they all did the same thing, where the world wasn't so constrained that you couldn't be all these things? So that was already fascinating me. And so but there was a second part to the tune, and I could not read it that well. And so I had written the chords above it. And the chords were A minor, G, F, E. And in this moment, I thought, okay, those are the chords. All right, I'm going to play arpeggios. G, F, E. Let me do it again. A. I already knew chords, so I could pull them in. G. And I'd already noticed that on the harp, unlike other instruments, every chord has the same shape. And so even though I could not read the music, I could use the same shapes over and over and over again. And I could make them go up. I could do this over and over and over again. And when I got lost, I could come back to that little melody. I could slow it down as much as I needed to, because I could add musicality to it. And then I could go back and I could play with that little progression. I didn't know it was called a progression, but it was called a progression from one chord to another, the A. And I discovered that while I could play arpeggios with it, I could also, if I started on it, I could do other things. I could make other shapes. And I could start having a conversation. I could slow down if I got lost, and build that in with musicality, not having to stutter. And every time I got lost, I would come back. I could do it lower. I could explore other parts of the harp. And then I could come back and I could do it again. I could start up high. That's the A. This is the G, the F. And what I'm doing at this point is I'm looking at the notes, I'm looking at the names, the chord names, and at first I couldn't play that much, but as I started doing this over and over again, and every night, and even from the beginning of playing it to the end of playing it, I got more and more familiar with what are these notes that I'm playing and what shapes am I on. So I started having a conversation with this piece that allowed me not only to play longer with it, but to be much more musical and to start having an experience with the piece. And at one point, even that first night, I realized, as a kid, I used to play hide and seek. And one of the things I loved about hide and seek was that you could, there was this home free. I can't even remember how it worked, but it was this thing called home free. You would be, maybe someone knows what that was. I just remember that it was this delicious feeling that you would be hiding, and then home free. There was a moment when you were at home free. And it was just this wonderful feeling. And I realized that this little melody, even though I had been lost, if I got lost with the music, this melody was my home free. I could always come back to this beautiful home free. And so for the first time, instrumental music offered me a framework in which I could play a game with myself and with music that sounded to other people as if I was playing music, because I was, but in my head, I was just, at first I was just hanging on to a framework. And eventually I got more and more comfortable with that framework. Eventually I was able to play with it even more. I was able to discover more ways to explore it, like with rhythms. Stuff like that. I discovered that there were more and more ways to play with it, to explore it. It became a framework, almost like a trellis that gave me structure, that gave me, all I can say is the word framework. And so I began to have a lifelong conversation with this piece. From that, I began, as I learned more about music and the musical forms and how music fits together. For example, as I started learning more about how a concerto might be put together with a fast movement and a slow movement and then a fast movement, and I began to realize, this is kind of at that point, it had become a fast movement. And so I could play around with it. Then I began to realize, what if I had a piece that was a companion piece to this, that was slower? So let's see. So the very first piece that I ever wrote for the harp was, in a sense, a companion piece to that, a slow piece that could be played and used many of the same chords. But then when that piece was over, I could shift and I could then play this piece. So it became the foundation of more. It began to expand. At first, the piece grounded me within the piece. At first, the melody grounded me, and what you'd call the B section, the second section of the piece, allowed me to take an adventure. That was the first grounded expansion that happened from this piece. I grounded in the melody, like I was like holding on to it, while I took more adventures with the this part, the part that is called a descending bass line part, because the bass line goes down and down. That was the first way I grounded with it. The second thing I was able to do, once I saw its role as the final movement in a concerto. And I had no right to be writing concertos at that point. Well, I mean, everyone has the right to write concertos. But I was just like, this is a form. This is a musical form, a slow movement and a fast movement. Even more fun is a fast movement and then a slow movement and then a fast movement. But by that time, I'd also started exploring using other techniques in it. The reason I want to show this, and it's so important to me, is that right now in Hip Harp Academy, this quarter is called Grounded Expansion. So it's all about this idea and how it plays out in every part of your life. Because for a while, even though on the side, this is what I was doing for a living, I also had this mindset of like, but to be a real musician, I have to learn to play these tunes. And I would learn to play, well, not these tunes, I have to learn to play these classical pieces by other people. So I did it. And I was learning the Handel Harp Concerto and I was learning the Dittersdorf Harp Concerto. By this time, my teacher was pushing me. I was playing Ravel and I was playing Debussy. And what happened is each time I'd learn a new piece, it was a new piece. I mean, it was completely new. Learning the Handel Harp Concerto, it helped me technically maybe with learning the Dittersdorf Harp Concerto, but they were completely different. Ravel was completely different. It was a whole, like, there was nothing to hold on to. It was just like start all over again. And I remember, because I'd started so late and because I was playing the harp and I really wanted to be in the orchestra because the conductor was such a brilliant man and I just wanted to do that. I was in an orchestra where people could sit and play stuff and I will have practiced for, hours and hours and still not be able to do it. And it was so frustrating. I remember just I was practicing one day at my harp and I made a mistake and I imagined what would happen if I did that in the orchestra and how the conductor would look at me. And I burst into tears. I threw myself on the floor and I can still feel, I just cried and I just said, why do I always have to work twice as hard to be half as good as everyone else? This was my experience of trying to be a classical musician and trying to play music that other people had written, trying to memorize it. And my brain couldn't memorize and trying and every piece being completely different and starting from zero. Meanwhile, over here in the secret, don't let anybody know you're doing this realm, I was doing the unthinkable, which was joyful, and I was improvising based on simple tunes, based on something I could do. And it just felt so wrong. Over here, oh, it's so easy. And here, when I'm doing the real thing, this is where it's hard. But what eventually happened is that I let go of that world, that classical world. There's so many people who can do such a beautiful job of it and love to do it. And I gave up trying to prove myself there. And because I really had come because I wanted to finish this musical. So anyway, that's a whole other story that we can look at. But following this path of grounded expansion, what happened is the piece grounded me in that melody. And it grounded me in that simple chord progression. And then I began to ask questions of the piece. What's the difference between this section and this one? And I can say that one was very melodic. The other one was more about, had a sense of I'm moving from here to there and I'm doing it in a repeated way. And then the word came to me of contrast. And I was like, oh, they're contrasting sections. Well, if they're contrasting sections, how could I create more contrast? And the reason I want to say this to you is I want to keep going back to this idea of improvisation and the idea of grounded expansion, that improvisation doesn't come out of nowhere. It's the expansion. It's like the growth of something, whether that growth is like a plant that's growing or an idea that's growing. And when something's growing and moving and a question comes into it, like what or an idea comes in, like, oh, contrast. Well, how do I create more contrast? And that's when I started exploring all these rhythms and started to bring in a percussive aspect to it. And then one thing I had always loved about music was cadenzas. And I've heard these all the time because my mother was an opera singer. So you would hear somebody, I don't think they're called cadenzas in opera, but you hear somebody singing along, and then there's this thing, they're singing the song, and then and then, but then not really, it's not really going to stop yet. I'm still going to tell you more. I really am. And then you come back to the thing. So I knew this gesture. The gesture is I'm going along, I'm saying something, and then wait, that thing opens up and it opens up and it opens up even bigger. And then it's as big as it possibly could be. And then it gets even bigger. And then you just stay there for a little while until you finally, when you're ready, but not before that moment, you come back, but you might not come back yet. But then you do come back. Not really yet. Now, there's this beautiful gesture. And I noticed that it was always happening on a certain chord in the music. And honestly, I don't know how the harp sounds here. To me, it sounds super soft, but I don't know how it sounds like in the computer. But I started realizing that there was this whole thing. If I go down this progression and I get to that last note, but I slow down, and then I really arrive on that note, I can stay. And I can start creating drama, which I love to do. And it's super easy on the harp because I can, even as a player who does not know what I'm doing, I could just watch my right hand. I don't know if you can tell this, but I'm keeping exactly the same shape all the way up. So I can just be dramatic. And then I get up here, more shapes. I'm doing the same shapes, and different from what I was doing it before, but it's still shapes. One is just a block chord, the other's broken. So as long as my eyes are taking me from one place to another, and that I've practiced, and it doesn't have to be fast. All of this can be amazingly slow. It's about the drama. It's equally good, fast or slow. You do have to ignore any notes you think aren't right at the moment. But that then becomes part of the beauty of it. Anyway, the point is that I began to see that it began to expand and expand and expand. So I was not making up something. I was improvising greater. Probably should have caught. So the conversation kept getting bigger and bigger. And in each case, I was having a conversation with music about something. So at first, I was having a conversation with the music about this. Just. I was having a conversation about that motion, which is A, then G, then F, then E. And the conversation that I was having had to do with the other things that I was doing. And then I can have that conversation again. Even though that line is now changing, I'm still having a conversation about A, G, F, E. Conversation about A, conversation about G, I'm saying the same thing about each one, F, and then E. And then if I want, maybe I want to hang out on that last little conversation, F, and then E, F. Maybe I want to flirt with E a little bit by going down to D, and then back to E. And then I can have a long, I need to change the levers here. I'm not going to go into why. Talk to music history about that. But then I can go into a conversation that's just about E. Or the relationship of E to F. I love that conversation. This is just a conversation about E and F when E is in the bass. And this is just a conversation about a shape that is called a sixth. It's a shape that I make with my fingers, still with the E in the bass, a conversation, kind of a monologue, but it's a conversation between that note and these notes. And when E and F and D are done having their conversation, I can come back and this little melody can have its say. And it's almost like the two are flirting with each other, because this one is like, oh yeah? Well, maybe you can make it even bigger. Do you think you can? And then the other part of the conversation says, yes, I can do that. Just let me try it. And then it's going like, hey, you. I'm sorry. It's a little harder on this harp because I have to, like I said, music history, talk about major and minor. We're not going to talk about it today. Just accept that I'm going to have to do something. Ignore it. Whatever. Anyway, so now I'm going to have a super big conversation about A. And then G, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this conversation goes on and on and on for several years. And then one day I ask myself again, but what? Oh no, this time it's a jealousy conversation. I have to, oh my goodness, it's time for me to go. Okay, all right, well, it's time for me to go. Next time, I'll see if Kathleen and I can talk about this. But this was the conversation. I'll try to get back on again sometime this week as well to talk about grounded expansion. When you have a place to start from, you can start having conversations with music that expand and expand and expand, that don't happen when you're playing piece to piece to piece to piece. But you must be able to have this conversation day after day, and you must be able to have it in words that you can speak versus feeling like, well, I don't even know what I'm saying. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say today. I'm off to Legacy Project meeting, and I will see you with Kathleen again. Oh, and Tovala says, my teacher saw me as a composer. Yay. I'm just wondering if that was me. And I love that. I love that. And now I want to see even more compositions from you, Tovla. So thank you, everybody, for listening, for watching, for being part of this conversation with Kathleen and me, even if we're not both here. And I will look forward to seeing you again next week. And thank you, everyone who's watching here now. Tovla, thank you so much for jumping in. And thank you for everyone who sends comments afterwards and who listens to us in ways in which you can't actually respond. Go forth, and harp on what you love.